The ink on the divorce papers had dried 5 years ago, leaving Ethan with nothing but a bruised ego and a silent vow to rebuild. He never expected that his path to redemption would lead him to a stack of overdue rent notices, with the name of the man who destroyed his marriage sitting right at the top. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was the universe handing him the gavel in a trial he thought was over. If you enjoy stories where the silence speaks louder than words and revenge is a dish best served with a signature, stay with me to see how this unfolds. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made everything look like it was crying. From the 24th floor of the Vantage Tower, Ethan Caldwell watched the gray drizzle slide down the floor-to-ceiling glass of his corner office. It was 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the city below was a blur of brake lights and wet pavement. "The acquisition papers for the Capitol Hill portfolio are on your desk, Mr. Caldwell," his assistant, Sarah, said, her voice soft over the intercom. "Do you need me to stay while you review them?" "No, Sarah. Go home. The storm is getting worse," Ethan replied, pressing the button to disconnect. He turned away from the window and sat at his mahogany desk. The surface was pristine, save for a single thick leather folder. This was what 5 years of relentless work had bought him: control. After his marriage imploded, Ethan had buried himself in real estate, turning a small inheritance into an empire of mid-rise apartments and commercial spaces. He didn't just buy buildings, he bought the silence that came with success. He opened the folder. The smell of fresh ink and expensive paper wafted up, the scent of ownership. The portfolio included 3 buildings. 2 were standard commercial lots, but the third was a residential pre-war building called the Alcott. It was a historic structure, charming but plagued by plumbing issues and negligent management. Ethan's plan was simple: renovate, rebrand, and triple the rent. It was just business. He flipped past the inspection reports to the tenant ledger. He needed to know which leases were expiring and who was behind on payments. His finger traced down the list of names. Unit 1A, vacant. Unit 2B, Smith, J, current. Unit 3C, Miller, K, 30 days past due. His finger stopped at Unit 4B. The breath caught in his throat, a sharp physical hitch that felt like a punch to the sternum. Unit 4B, Vance, Julian, and Caldwell, Claire. Status: 90 days delinquent. Pending legal action. Ethan stared at the names. The letters seemed to vibrate on the page. Claire. 5 years ago, he had come home early from a business trip to find Claire's car in the driveway and a strange leather jacket on the entryway table. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't thrown things. He had simply walked to the bedroom door, seen the tangled sheets and the unfamiliar man. Julian, a visionary painter with paint under his fingernails and no job, and he had closed the door. He packed a bag and left the keys on the kitchen counter. He had given her everything because he couldn't bear to fight for something that was already broken. He thought they had moved to Portland. He thought she was living the bohemian dream she had always accused Ethan of stifling with his ambition, but they were here, in Seattle, living in a crumbling building that he had just bought. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking in the silence of the office. He looked at the status column again. 90 days delinquent. They were broke. They were failing. And unknowingly, they were sleeping under a roof that belonged to him. A dark, unfamiliar feeling curled in his stomach. It wasn't anger. That had burned out years ago. It was something colder. It was the heavy, intoxicating weight of leverage. He picked up his fountain pen, the metal cool against his skin. He circled Unit 4B. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for the property management firm he used as a buffer. "Mr. Caldwell," the manager answered on the second ring, sounding surprised. "The Alcott building," Ethan said, his voice steady, betraying none of the thunder in his chest. "I'm taking over the management of that property personally. Don't send out the standard welcome letters. I want to review every lease myself." "Personally, sir? That's a bit below your pay grade, isn't it?" Ethan looked at the rain lashing against the window, reflecting his own ghost in the glass. "No," Ethan whispered. "I think this is exactly where I need to be." Ethan did not go home that night. Instead, he spent the hours between midnight and dawn restructuring the legal ownership of the Alcott. He buried his name under layers of bureaucracy. The building was no longer owned by Caldwell and Partners. It was now the property of Obsidian Holdings LLC, a faceless shell company with a P.O. box in downtown Seattle and no listed phone number. He wanted to be a ghost with the power to turn up the heat or shut off the water. 2 days later, the rain had settled into a thick, damp fog that clung to the hills of the city. Ethan canceled his afternoon meetings, telling Sarah he had a site inspection. It wasn't a lie, though he had no intention of stepping out of his car. He drove his black Range Rover up Pike Street, the leather-heated seat offering a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. As he crossed into the neighborhood where the Alcott stood, the scenery shifted. The high-end boutiques and tech offices faded, replaced by vintage shops, dive bars, and apartment buildings that had seen better decades. He parked across the street from the Alcott. The engine purred silently as he killed the headlights. The building was a 4-story brick structure that might have been romantic in the summer sunlight, but in the gray afternoon, it just looked tired. The fire escape was rusting, and a collection of overflowing recycling bins lined the curb. Ethan waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for, perhaps just to confirm that the names on the ledger were real people, not just ghosts from his past. At 5:15 p.m., the front door of the building swung open. Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, the leather creaking audibly. It was Julian. He looked older than Ethan remembered. The artistic scruff was now an unkempt beard, and he wore a wool coat that was missing a button. He stood on the stoop, lighting a cigarette with cupped hands, his posture slumped against the doorframe. There was no defiance in his stance, only exhaustion. A moment later, a woman rounded the corner, struggling with 2 heavy paper grocery bags. The bottom of one bag was wet, threatening to tear. Claire. She had cut her hair. It used to be long, blonde waves that she spent hours styling. Now it was a short, practical bob that hung limp around her face. She wore a beige trench coat that Ethan recognized. He had bought it for her 6 years ago. It looked gray now, stained by the city soot. Ethan watched through the tinted glass of his car, feeling like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. He watched Julian take a drag of his cigarette, not moving to help her. Claire stopped at the bottom of the stairs, shifting the weight of the bags. She said something to Julian. He didn't look at her. He just shrugged and blew smoke into the damp air. Claire's shoulders dropped. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but Ethan saw it. It was the posture of a woman who had stopped expecting things to be easy. She trudged up the stairs, maneuvering around Julian to get inside. He didn't hold the door. The passionate, fiery love that Claire had claimed she needed, the kind that Ethan's stability allegedly suffocated, looked remarkably like indifference from this vantage point. Ethan felt a strange cocktail of emotions: vindication, pity, and a cold resolve. They weren't living a bohemian dream. They were just surviving. And they were 3 months behind on rent. He put the car in gear. He had seen enough. The faceless landlord was about to make his introduction, not with a handshake, but with a piece of paper. As he pulled away from the curb, his phone buzzed. He ignored it. He had a letter to draft. The printer in Ethan's office hummed, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to slice through the quiet morning. It spat out a single sheet of paper. Stark white, heavy bond, with the header Obsidian Holdings LLC centered in bold, black typeface. It was a standard Washington State 3-day notice to pay or quit. Ethan picked it up. The language was cold, legal, and devoid of empathy. Pursuant to RCW 5912-030, failure to comply will result in unlawful detainer proceedings. It was a threat dressed in a suit. He signed the bottom line, not with his name, but with an illegible scrawl representing the LLC. He sealed it in a red envelope, the color of urgency, and placed it in the outgoing mail tray. "Send it via courier," he instructed his assistant. "Direct delivery. Require a signature." Across the city, in Unit 4B of the Alcott, the morning light filtered through dusty blinds, casting striped shadows across a floor cluttered with drop cloths and half-finished canvases. The apartment smelled of turpentine and stale coffee. Claire was in the kitchen, scraping the last bit of peanut butter from a jar onto a piece of toast. The heater clanked and hissed, but the room remained stubbornly chilly. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. A sharp rap on the door made her jump. "Julian?" she called out. "Are you expecting someone?" From the living room, where Julian was staring at a blank canvas, a muffled grunt was the only reply. Claire sighed and walked to the door. A courier stood there, holding a tablet and a red envelope. "Delivery for the occupant," he said. Claire signed, her hand trembling slightly. Couriers didn't bring good news to this address. She closed the door and tore open the envelope. The words "Notice to pay or quit" leaped out at her. She scanned the numbers. Past due rent, late fees, administrative penalties. The total was over $4,000. They had 3 days to pay it in full, or the eviction process would begin. The toast turned to ash in her mouth. The previous landlord, Mr. Henderson, had been an old man who accepted partial payments and sob stories. This Obsidian Holdings, whoever they were, didn't care about stories. "Julian," she said, her voice tight. She walked into the living room. Julian didn't look up. He was mixing a shade of blue on his palette. "What is it? I'm in the flow, Claire." "We have 3 days," she said, holding the paper up. "The new owners. They want all the back rent. Now, or we're out." Julian finally looked up, annoyance flickering in his eyes. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Let me see." He snatched the paper, read it for barely 2 seconds, and tossed it onto the coffee table. Right on top of a pile of unpaid utility bills. "Scare tactics," he scoffed. "They can't kick us out in 3 days. It takes months to evict someone in this city. Tenants have rights." "This isn't a game, Julian," Claire snapped, the panic rising in her chest. "Look at the letterhead. This is a corporation. They have lawyers. We don't have rent money, let alone lawyer money. So what do you want me to do?" Julian stood up, his voice rising. "Paint faster? Sell a kidney? You know the gallery show is coming up next month. Once that happens, we'll be fine." "Next month?" Claire laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "We don't have a month. We have 72 hours. Maybe you could, I don't know, pick up a shift at the bar? Just for a few weeks." Julian's face darkened. "I told you, I'm done serving drinks to yuppies. It kills my creativity." "You're supposed to support the process, Claire. That was the deal. We left that suffocating life with Ethan so we could be real." The name hung in the air like smoke. Ethan. Claire looked at the man she had blown up her life for. He stood there in his stained t-shirt, arrogant and defenseless, refusing to solve a problem he helped create. She remembered Ethan sitting at the kitchen table on Sunday nights, organizing bills, making sure she never had to worry about a roof over her head. She had called it boring. She had called it controlling. Right now, looking at the red envelope on the table, it felt like something else entirely. "I'm going to work," Claire whispered. She grabbed her purse. She didn't kiss him goodbye. As she walked out into the damp hallway, she felt the walls of the Alcott closing in. She didn't know that miles away, in a tower of glass and steel, the man she had left was waiting for the clock to start ticking. The boiler at the Alcott died at 3 a.m. on a Thursday, plunging the building into an icy silence. By 8 a.m., the temperature inside the uninsulated brick walls had dropped to 45 degrees. Ethan received the call while drinking his espresso in his penthouse kitchen. The property manager, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, no relation to the previous owner, suggested calling a contractor and waiting for a report. "No," Ethan said, setting his cup down. "I'll meet the contractor there. We need to inspect the radiators in every unit to ensure the pipes haven't burst. It's an emergency access situation." "You want to go into the units, sir? Yourself?" "Every single one," Ethan replied. He arrived at the Alcott an hour later. He wore a heavy charcoal wool coat, a cashmere scarf pulled up to his chin, and dark sunglasses. He looked like a shadow against the morning frost. The contractor, a burly man with a toolbox, was waiting by the service entrance. They moved through the first 3 floors quickly. The tenants were huddled in blankets, angry and shivering, demanding answers. Ethan said nothing, letting the contractor do the talking. He simply observed, checking for leaks, checking the structural integrity, checking his investment. Then they reached the 4th floor. Ethan's heart rate remained steady, a testament to years of boardroom negotiations, but his hands clenched deep in his pockets. He nodded to the contractor. The man knocked on Unit 4B. "Maintenance. Emergency inspection for leaks." There was a delay, then the sound of a chain sliding. The door opened. The smell hit Ethan first. Not dirty exactly, but stale. It smelled of old oil paint, damp wool, and the distinct, sour scent of stress. Julian stood in the doorway. He was wearing a bathrobe over sweatpants, his feet bare on the hardwood floor. He looked shivering and miserable. "About time," Julian muttered, stepping aside without looking at their faces. "It's freezing in here. My paints are thickening up." Ethan stepped across the threshold. It was the first time he had been in a room with Julian since that afternoon 5 years ago. Back then, he had only seen the back of Julian's head and the curve of his wife's shoulder. Now he was standing in their living room. The apartment was a disaster. The charming historic details Ethan had noted in the listing were covered in clutter. Canvases were stacked against the walls. Dirty dishes were piled on a coffee table that Ethan recognized. It was a cheap particle board piece, likely found on the street. The contractor went to the radiator under the window, banging on the valve with a wrench. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning. He looked for traces of Claire. He saw her shoes by the door, worn down at the heels. He saw a mug on the counter with lipstick stain on the rim, and he saw the lack of everything else. There was no TV, no books, just the tools of Julian's genius and the debris of their poverty. "So," Julian said, leaning against the doorframe, watching the contractor. He didn't even glance at Ethan, who was standing silently in the back. To Julian, Ethan was just another suit, another faceless figure of authority to be ignored. "Is the landlord going to compensate us for this? It's inhumane. I can't work in these conditions." Ethan turned his head slowly. He looked at Julian. He saw the arrogance that masked deep insecurity. This was the man Claire had chosen? This was the passion she had traded her life for? "Compensation follows rent payment," Ethan said. His voice was low, gravelly, altered by the scarf and the cold. Julian stiffened. He finally looked at Ethan. For a second, their eyes met. Ethan's eyes were cold, hard flint behind the dark glasses. Julian squinted, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, as if a memory was trying to surface, but couldn't quite break through the fog of his own ego. "Excuse me," Julian bristled. "Who are you? The owner?" "I represent the owner," Ethan said, turning away. "The pipes are fine here. Clean up the debris around the radiator. It's a fire hazard." "Debris? That's my art," Julian snapped. "It's combustible trash," Ethan corrected, walking toward the door. "You have 24 hours to clear it, or it's a lease violation." He stepped out into the hallway, the air suddenly feeling fresher despite the smell of mildew. He didn't look back. He had seen the enemy, and the enemy was small. As the door clicked shut behind him, he heard Julian cursing, the sound muffled and pathetic. Ethan adjusted his scarf. The boiler would be fixed by noon, but the chill in Unit 4B wasn't going anywhere. Claire's shift at the bakery had ended early, not because of kindness, but because the heating system in the shop had failed, much like the one in her building. She trudged up the 4 flights of stairs to Unit 4B, her legs heavy with a fatigue that sleep never seemed to cure. In her hand, she clutched a bag of day-old bagels. Dinner. As she reached the 3rd-floor landing, she heard voices drifting down from above. One was Julian's, shrill and complaining, a tone she had grown exhausted of hearing. The other voice was deeper, calmer, a low baritone that vibrated through the stairwell in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up. It sounded like a ghost. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. It was just the stress. It was just the cold. She rounded the final corner to the 4th floor. The door to their apartment was wide open. The contractor was packing up a heavy metal toolbox, muttering about overtime. Standing in the doorway, blocking the view of the messy living room inside, was a man in a charcoal wool coat. His back was to her. The cut of the coat was impeccable, the fabric expensive, starkly out of place against the peeling yellow paint of the hallway walls. "The debris needs to be cleared by tomorrow," the man said. His voice was ice. "Or the lease is void." Claire stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, audible gasp. The man turned slowly. Time didn't just stop, it shattered. Ethan stood there. Not the Ethan she had left. The man in the soft sweaters who smiled too much and tried too hard. This was a different man. His jaw was set, his hair styled with a precision she didn't recognize, and his eyes were dark, impenetrable voids behind his glasses. He took off the sunglasses, folding them deliberately. He looked at her. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He didn't scream. "Ethan," the word fell out of her mouth, barely a whisper. Brittle and terrified. Inside the apartment, Julian appeared behind Ethan's shoulder, wiping paint on a rag. "You're back," Julian said to Claire, completely missing the tension that was sucking the oxygen out of the hallway. He gestured to Ethan. "This is the representative for the owner. A real charmer. Says my art is a fire hazard." Julian laughed, a scoffing, arrogant sound. He looked at Ethan, then at Claire, and finally the silence seemed to penetrate his self-absorption. He frowned. "Wait, do you two know each other?" Ethan ignored Julian entirely. He kept his gaze fixed on Claire. He looked at the bag of stale bagels in her hand. He looked at the grayness of her skin, the lines of worry etched around her mouth, the cheap coat that was too thin for the weather. He took a step forward. Claire instinctively took a step back, her heel hitting the edge of the stair. "Ms. Caldwell," Ethan said. The formality was a slap in the face. He used her married name, the name she had kept because changing it cost money she didn't have. "You," Claire stammered. Her mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. "You own this building." "My company owns this building," Ethan corrected smoothly. He reached into his inner pocket. Claire flinched, as if he were reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a sleek black business card and held it out to her. She didn't take it. He placed it on the banister railing beside her. "Rent is due on the 1st, Claire. No exceptions, no partial payments." His voice was devoid of any emotion. It wasn't angry. It was transactional. "And tell Mr. Vance that if I find turpentine stored near a radiator again, eviction will be immediate." "Ethan, please," she whispered, her eyes filling with sudden hot tears. "We didn't know. I didn't know." "Ignorance of ownership doesn't absolve the debt," he said. He stepped past her. As he moved, she smelled him. Sandalwood and cold air, a scent that used to mean safety. Now it smelled like judgment. He walked down the stairs, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the concrete steps. Click, 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 the sound of a clock counting down. Claire stood frozen on the landing, staring at the empty space where her husband used to be. Julian walked out into the hall, picking up the business card. "Ethan Caldwell," Julian read aloud, confusion twisting his face. "Caldwell. Wait, Claire, isn't that?" He looked at her, the realization finally dawning, slow and horrified. Claire didn't answer. She just looked at the stairs, listening until the front door of the building slammed shut, sealing them in the cold. The morning sun reflected off the glass facade of the vantage tower, blindingly bright. Down on the pavement, Julian Vance adjusted the collar of his only blazer. It was a velvet jacket, vintage, smelling faintly of mothballs. He checked his reflection in the building's glass, smoothing down his beard. "He's doing this to get to me," Julian said, for the 10th time that morning. "It's classic alpha posturing. He wants a reaction. I'm going to go in there, look him in the eye and handle it. Man to man." Claire stood beside him, clutching her purse with white-knuckled fingers. She felt nauseous. "Julian, we owe him $4,000. It's not posturing, it's math." "It's jealousy, Claire," Julian snapped, turning to the revolving doors. "Come on!" They took the elevator to the 24th floor. The reception area of Obsidian Holdings, the shell company Ethan used, was minimalist and intimidating. Everything was white marble and silent efficiency. When they were ushered into the conference room, Ethan was already seated at the head of a long table that looked like a slab of black ice. He didn't stand up. He didn't offer his hand. He was typing on a laptop, the rhythmic clack, 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 the only sound in the room. "Mr. Caldwell," Julian announced, his voice booming slightly too loud for the acoustic dampening of the room. He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. Claire hovered by the door, terrified to enter. Ethan stopped typing. He closed the laptop slowly. He looked at Julian, then briefly at Claire, before returning his gaze to the man sitting opposite him. "Mr. Vance," Ethan said, You requested a meeting regarding the delinquency of Unit 4B. You have 5 minutes. Look, let's cut the corporate act. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He tried to summon the charm that had won Claire over 5 years ago. The roguish, intense artist routine. I know who you are. I know you used to be married to Claire. And I get it. Seeing us together, it stings. So you bought the building to squeeze us. It's a little petty, don't you think? Claire closed her eyes. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Ethan didn't blink. His expression didn't shift. He reached for a file folder and slid it across the smooth surface of the table. It stopped perfectly at the edge, right in front of Julian. This is a ledger of your payments for the last 12 months, Ethan said, his voice terrifyingly calm. You've been late 8 times. You've bounced 2 checks. You are currently 90 days in arrears. My acquisition of the building was a portfolio purchase of 3 distressed assets. You are simply a line item in a spreadsheet that is currently in the red. I'm an artist, Julian argued, his voice losing some of its confident edge. My gallery showing is next month. The money is coming. I just need an extension. You can't just throw people on the street because of a temporary cash flow problem. I can, Ethan said, and I will. Because you hate me, Julian accused, slamming his hand on the table. Ethan finally smiled. It was a small, thin curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a rabbit that thought it was a threat. I don't hate you, Julian, Ethan said softly. I don't think about you at all. You live in my building. You don't pay rent. That makes you a liability. In my world, liabilities are liquidated. He checked his watch. Your 5 minutes are up. Unless you have a certified check for $4,200, the eviction notice stands. You have 24 hours left. Julian opened his mouth to argue, but the air had left the room. He looked at Ethan, immaculate, wealthy, powerful, and then looked down at his own fraying velvet cuffs. The disparity was absolute. There was no rivalry here. There was only a landlord and a tenant. Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Come on, Claire. We're leaving. We don't need to beg to this. Corporate drone? Julian stormed out, trying to salvage his dignity with a dramatic exit. Claire didn't move immediately. She stood by the door looking at Ethan. He had already opened his laptop again. He didn't look up at her. He had dismissed them as easily as closing a browser tab. Ethan, she whispered. 24 hours, Miss Caldwell, he said, without pausing his typing. She turned and ran after Julian, the sound of her ex-husband's indifference chasing her all the way to the elevator. The receptionist had gone home for the night. The lights in the corridor of the vantage tower were dimmed to a low, ambient blue. Ethan was still there, standing by the window, watching the ferry boats cut white wakes across the dark water of Puget Sound. He heard the elevator ding, followed by the hesitation of footsteps on the plush carpet. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. He had told security to let her up. Julian isn't with me, Claire's voice came from the doorway. It was small, stripped of the defensive edge she had worn earlier. Ethan turned. She had changed out of her work clothes into a dress he remembered. It was a soft navy blue silk that she used to wear to his company Christmas parties. It was tight on her now, not because she had gained weight, but because it looked like a costume from a life that no longer fit her. I didn't think he would be, Ethan said. He walked over to his desk but didn't sit. He leaned against the edge, crossing his arms. He has too much pride to beg, but not enough to pay his bills. Claire flinched. She walked into the room, the distance between them feeling like miles of cold floor. He's struggling, Ethan. The art world is hard. He's brilliant, but he's misunderstood. He's lazy, Claire, Ethan corrected flatly. And you know it. The silence that followed was heavy. Claire looked down at her hands. She twisted her wedding ring. No, not a wedding ring. It was a simple silver band Julian had made for her out of spoon wire. It looked cheap and tarnished under the office lights. I made a mistake, she whispered. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You need to be more specific. You're 3 months behind on rent. That's the mistake we are discussing. No, she looked up, her eyes wet. I mean, us. Leaving. I thought. She took a step closer, her voice trembling. I thought passion was enough. I thought the stability you gave me was a cage. But now, I'm tired, Ethan. I'm so cold. The apartment is freezing, and I'm working double shifts, and he just paints and complains. I miss. I miss feeling safe. She looked at him with a desperate, naked hope. She was banking on the history, on the 5 years of marriage where he had worshipped the ground she walked on. She was offering him her regret as currency, hoping it was enough to buy a lease extension. Ethan looked at her. He waited for the anger. He waited for the satisfaction of hearing her say she was wrong. He waited for the old ache of heartbreak, but nothing came. He looked at the woman who had decimated his self-worth 5 years ago, and he felt nothing. He didn't want to hold her. He didn't want to yell at her. He just wanted to go home, pour a scotch, and read a book in his quiet, warm living room. "You're not missing me, Claire," Ethan said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. "You're missing the heating bill I used to pay." "That's not true," she sobbed, reaching out to touch his arm. He stepped back. The movement was smooth, instinctive, and final. Her hand hovered in the air, touching nothing but the conditioned air of his office. "I can't help you," he said. "Not because I'm angry, but because I'm a landlord, and you are a tenant who cannot pay. That is the extent of our relationship now. You're going to throw us out? You're going to let me sleep on the street?" "I'm going to follow the law," Ethan said. He walked to the door and held it open. "You have until noon tomorrow to vacate. I suggest you go home and start packing. Julian is going to need help moving those canvases." Claire stared at him, searching his face for a trace of the husband she had known. She found only a stranger in a tailored suit. The realization crushed her more than the eviction notice. She hadn't just lost the apartment. She had lost the power to hurt him. She walked past him, her head bowed, the navy blue dress swishing softly, a funeral march for a marriage that had died a long time ago. "Goodbye, Claire," Ethan said. He closed the door. The click of the latch was the loudest sound in the world. Noon arrived with the punctuality of a hangman. In Unit 4B, the boxes were packed, haphazardly, desperately. Julian was sitting on a stack of art books, staring at the floor, while Claire paced the length of the living room, waiting for the heavy knock of the King County Sheriff. But the knock never came. 1 o'clock passed, then 2. The silence in the hallway was deafening. Claire moved to the window, peering through the dirty glass, expecting to see a squad car. Instead, she saw a sleek black sedan pull up to the curb. 2 men in hard hats got out, followed by a woman carrying a surveyor's tripod. Across town in the climate-controlled boardroom of Caldwell and Partners, Ethan uncapped his fountain pen. Across the table sat Marcus Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Development, a firm notorious for raising historic neighborhoods to build high-density, glass-box condos. They were known for their efficiency and their complete lack of sentimentality. "You're sure about this, Ethan?" Marcus asked, tapping the stack of documents. "We're buying the LLC as is. That means we inherit the liabilities, including the delinquent tenants in Unit 4B?" Ethan looked down at the papers. The sale price was aggressive. He was making a 40% profit on the acquisition he had made only a week ago. But the money wasn't the point. "The tenants in 4B are no longer my concern," Ethan said calmly. "They are a line item. Manage them as you see fit." "We'll have the building vacated by the end of the month," Marcus grinned, showing too many teeth. "We plan to demolish in the spring. We don't do extensions or sob stories." Ethan signed his name. The ink flowed smooth and black, a final signature on a chapter that had dragged on for 5 years. With that stroke, he didn't just sell a building. He severed the last invisible thread connecting him to Claire. He wasn't evicting her. That would have been personal. That would have required him to care. Selling the building to a shark like Sterling? That was just business. It was the ultimate act of indifference. "Done," Ethan said, sliding the folder across the table. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. He felt lighter, as if gravity had loosened its grip on him. Half an hour later, Ethan drove his Range Rover toward the highway. He didn't intend to go past the Alcott, but the on-ramp traffic forced a detour. As he idled at the red light across from the building, he looked up at the 4th-floor window. He saw a figure standing there. It was Claire. She was looking down at the street, watching the surveyors mark the pavement with orange spray paint, the universal sign of impending demolition. She looked small, trapped behind the glass of a life she had chosen. She didn't see him. The tint on his windows was too dark. The light turned green. Ethan didn't linger. He didn't feel a surge of triumph, and he didn't feel a pang of regret. The anger that had fueled him for years had evaporated, replaced by the cool, clean air of the future. He pressed the accelerator. The engine roared to life, pulling him away from the decaying brick building, away from the rain-slicked streets of Capitol Hill, and onto the open freeway. He merged into traffic, blending into the stream of red taillights, just another driver in the city, finally heading home to a house that was quiet, peaceful, and entirely his own. The rearview mirror was empty. He didn't check it again.